APUSH Period 7 Politics of the Twenties and the Great Depression, 1920 to 1929. Politically, the decade marked a retreat from the progressive spirit. Presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover all embraced conservatism. Harding promised a, quote, return to normalcy, a retreat from reform and activism. Coolidge declared, the business of America is business. Hoover, though progressive in some respects, believed in rugged individualism, the idea that local communities, not federal government, should solve problems. Republicans dominated, favoring high tariffs, low taxes, and minimal government interference. Business and government worked hand in hand. Corruption, however, reared its head, most infamously in the Teapot Dome scandal, where government lands were leased to oilmen in exchange for bribes. The politics of the 20s reflected the mood of a public weary of crusades and eager for stability. Yet, they also revealed a complacency that would prove costly when crisis struck. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover presided over a nation that worshiped business success. High tariffs protected American industry. The Fort Macomber Tariff of 1922 raised rates, prompting other nations to retaliate, slowing global trade. But at home, prosperity seemed endless. Government regulators often acted more as partners than watchdogs. Lobbyists thrived and business leaders enjoyed unprecedented access. Harding's administration, riddled with scandal, revealed the dangers of such intimacy. Yet Coolidge's honesty and restraint reassured many. His quiet demeanor and faith in free markets made him a symbol of the decade's conservatism. Coolidge, who assumed the presidency after Harding's death in 1923, embodied restraint. Known as Silent Cal, he spoke little but acted with clarity. He vetoed measures he considered extravagant, championed limited government, and presided over prosperity. In 1924, he easily won election, though progressive candidate Robert Lafayette made a strong showing among farmers and workers. Coolidge chose not to run again in 1928, leaving office with a reputation for integrity and conservatism. His quote, "The business of America is business," became the creed of the decade. Not all shared in the prosperity. Union membership fell, weakened by the Red Scare. Anti labor sentiment and the popularity of the open shop, where workers were not required to join unions. Strikes were crushed and wages lagged behind profits. Farmers fared worse. Wartime demand had encouraged expansion, but peace brought falling prices. New technology produced bumper crops, deepening the glut. Debt mounted and foreclosures spread. While cities roared with prosperity, rural America languished. The unevenness of the 1920s economy was stark, a foreshadowing of what was to come. The election of 1928 pitted Republican Herbert Hoover against Democrat Alfred E. Smith. Hoover, famed for his humanitarian work during World War I and his service as Commerce Secretary, symbolized competence and modernity. Smith, governor of New York, embodied urban immigrant America, Catholic and wet on prohibition, and unapologetically cosmopolitan. The campaign revealed cultural divisions. Anti Catholic prejudice flourished. Rural voters recoiled from Smith's urban style. Hoover triumphed in a landslide, but the election underscored the fractures in American society. Within a year, Hoover would face a crisis that tested him beyond imagination. Though America rejected the League of Nations, it did not retreat entirely. In the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, nations agreed to limit battleships and respect territories in the Pacific. The Calabrian Pact of 1928 went further, renouncing war as an instrument of policy. Lofty though it was, the pact had no teeth. Defensive wars were still allowed and enforcement was impossible. These efforts reflected America's ambivalence. unwilling to entangle itself in Europe, yet eager to shape peace. Idealism and isolationism walked side by side. America emerged from the war as a creditor nation. European nations owed billions, but their recovery was slow. High tariffs in the U.S. hampered trade, and Germany, burdened with reparations, teetered on collapse. The Dawes Plan in 1924 sought to stabilize the system. American banks loaned money to Germany, which paid reparations to Britain and France, who in turn repaid their debts to the U.S. It was a fragile cycle, dependent on American credit. When the U.S. economy faltered in 1929, the system unraveled. Prosperity had been built on shaky foundations, and the collapse was global. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, panic gripped Wall Street. Stock prices, inflated by speculation and margin buying, collapsed. Within days, billions in wealth evaporated. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Farmers, already struggling, saw markets vanish. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. The Depression was more than an economic crisis, it was a crisis of confidence. Breadlines and Hoovervilles dotted the landscape. Families lost homes, children went hungry, and despair spread. For a nation that had believed prosperity permanent, the shock was profound. The roaring '20s ended not with a whimper, but with a crash heard around the world. The collapse of 1929 was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a profound unraveling. By 1930, the panic on Wall Street had spread into every corner of the economy. Overproduction in agriculture and industry had left warehouses full, yet wages were too low for ordinary Americans to buy what they had produced. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand during wartime prosperity now faced foreclosure as crop prices plummeted. Banks, many of them small and undercapitalized, fell one after another. With each failure, savings vanished, confidence evaporated, and the panic deepened. By 1933, some 9,000 banks had closed their doors. The unemployment rate soared to 25%. In industrial city centers, it was even higher. Men lined up for bread. Children went to bed hungry, and families built shacks and makeshift Hoovervilles on the edges of cities. The Depression was not merely economic, it was psychological. The American creed of opportunity and self reliance seemed to collapse with the markets. The people who had done everything right, saved money, bought homes, built businesses, saw it all vanish. The crash tested not only the economy, but the very faith of Americans in their institutions. Historians have long debated the cause of the Depression, but several threads are clear. Overproduction was central. Factories and farms alike produced more than could be consumed. And with wages stagnant, demand lagged behind supply. The wealth of the 1920s was unevenly distributed. The top few percent grew rich, while many others lived on the edge. The financial system magnified the danger. Speculation in the stock market was rampant. Buying, quote, on margin, that is, borrowing money to buy stocks, created a bubble. When prices faltered, margin calls wiped out investors, and the panic spread. International factors compounded the crisis. High U.S. tariffs choked off global trade. European nations still struggling from World War I depended on American loans. When the U.S. economy faltered, the whole fragile structure collapsed. Germany defaulted on reparations. Britain and France stumbled, and the Depression spread worldwide. The calamity revealed that the weaknesses of a system built on optimism but lacking safeguards. It was not merely bad luck, it was structural instability on a grand scale. Herbert Hoover, who had taken office in 1929 with a reputation as a humanitarian and problem solver, suddenly faced the greatest economic disaster in American history. His instinct was to act, but within limits. Hoover believed deeply in rugged individualism, the conviction that local communities, not the federal government, should solve social problems. He encouraged businesses to maintain wages and avoid layoffs, urged private charities to expand relief, and created agencies like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932 to provide loans to banks and businesses. but he refused to provide direct aid to individuals, fearing it would undermine self reliance. To desperate Americans, these efforts seemed timid, even callous. The sight of the Bonus Army, World War I veterans who marched on Washington in 1932 demanding early payment of bonuses and were driven away by troops, became emblematic of Hoover's failure to grasp the depth of the crisis. By 1932, his name had become a symbol of despair. Hoovervilles for shantytowns, Hoover blankets for newspapers wrapped around the homeless. In the summer of 1932, as the Depression deepened, thousands of World War I veterans descended upon Washington, D.C. They came not as radicals, but as patriots, men who had once fought in the trenches of France and now, in their middle years, sought the payment of promised bonuses. Hungry and unemployed, they built encampments on the Anacostia Flats, makeshift Hoovervilles of tents and shacks. Their demand was simple: pay the bonus now, not years later. But the government hesitated. To officials, the sight of ragged veterans crowding the Capitol seemed a threat. President Hoover ordered their dispersal. Troops under Douglas MacArthur advanced with bayonets and tear gas. The veterans fled, their camps in flames. The image was devastating. Men who had once borne arms for the nation now driven off by its army. Hoover's reputation, already battered, suffered irreparable damage. To many Americans, the bonus army symbolized the government's indifference to suffering. It became a rallying cry for change. This ends the video.